Good afternoon and good evening, colleagues and partners. My name is Francis Guesquière. I'm the practice manager for the Urban Development and DRM program of the World Bank in the East Asia region. Lauren will intervene a little bit later. We have changed the order today because we have the honor of having Elizabeth Yee, Chief of Staff of the Rockefeller Foundation, who will introduce the speakers and say a few words about the new program launched by the Rockefeller Foundation. We'll then have our two speakers, and then Lauren will tell us about an initiative launched by the Global Resilient Cities Network, which receives support from the World Bank as well. And we'll have comments from Sameh Wahba, the Director of the Urban and Disaster Risk Management at the World Bank. So my role is to welcome you. And before I hand off to the screen to Liz to say a few words about the speakers, as I said, let me quickly remind you and remind everyone of the intention of this speaker series and the ground rule for the conversation today. The purpose of these global webinars is to have open and honest learning conversation between practitioners in cities and government partners and others supporting those entities. The calls are not on the record, and we ask that you do not attribute any comments made today or questions asked to the speakers or others unless the material are made available after the call, or unless in the material that is made available, or you have the person express permission to do so. So please do not quote people unless you ask for their permission. The response to the seminar today. We have more than 600 people registered. Needless to say, to make it possible to manage the question, please ask the question in the Q&A function of the WebEx. You can also use the chat function if you want to talk to each other, but for question, please use the Q&A function. We will group them and then go to them one after the other. Without further ado, let me pass on to Elizabeth Yee, the Chief of Staff of the Rockefeller Foundation. Elizabeth, the screen is yours. Elizabeth, are you there? Oh, Liz, go ahead. Liz, you can speak now. I think you're on mute still. Maybe on double mute. Nini, can you check? For some reason, Liz, we can't hear you. Maybe your phone is muted, maybe your computer. We tried 10 minutes ago and it was working. Yes, your line is unmuted, so you should be able to speak. Well, we fixed this. Maybe I will ask Lauren then to intervene and introduce the speakers, and then we'll try to come back to you, Liz.
Okay, sure. And sorry about the technical difficulty, everyone. Our first speaker tonight is our Chief Resilience Officer from Belfast. She is also a member of our Global Steering Committee, and I'm really thrilled to be introducing to you Ms. Grainia, who will be telling us about the recovery and response efforts in the city of Belfast. Grainia?
Thank you, Lauren. Thank you very much indeed. I'm going to share my screen. And afternoon from Belfast. This afternoon here in Belfast. And I'm delighted to take part in this panel discussion, really thrilled to be talking to you a little bit about why a resilient recovery is so critically important for Belfast, and I would argue critically important globally as well. So Lauren, I hope you can see my screen okay, and unfortunately my webcam is not operational, but you should be able to see my screen, Lauren.
We can see your screen and we're putting up the slides right now.
Fantastic. Okay. So, look, welcome to Belfast, virtually welcome to Belfast, my home and a home for just under 340,000 people, and that's us. We are the capital city of the region of Northern Ireland, which administratively is part of the United Kingdom and geographically sits on the island of Ireland, and we're on the west coast of Europe. And a very vibrant city, a city where connectivity is really, really important to us. Our ability to connect with other cities, both across the United Kingdom and in Ireland, and our ability to connect with cities at a European level and at a global level, really, really important to us. We're a university city, a port city. We have very strong industrial heritage, culture, creative industry, and increasingly a destination to visit, and our visitor numbers globally growing all of the time. And for those of us like me who've lived in other cities and lived in London, the attraction of coming back to a city like Belfast, where the quality of life is so high, is one that's now replicated by many in the city. So why for us resilience? Why is it so important to our recovery post-COVID that resilience is baked in, if you will? And as somebody said to me yesterday, how do you even go about thinking about recovery? And of course, that's a critical challenge for all of us and for cities. Fundamentally, though, for cities like Belfast, the risks that were there before the crisis, by and large, still remain. And I want to share with you an image which is has been developed by an organisation called Climate Central, and this shows maps our flood risk, our coastal risk, and our river and surface water risks, maps it with land elevation, and it shows, as you can see, the potential impact to land within our city by 2050. And that's a really critical economic risk for the city, but of course it's a critical social risk. So therefore, climate change and the impact of climate change, those risks that were there before the pandemic remain, we're now tackling them alongside another major challenge. So if we are looking either nationally or globally at stimulus and how we recover from COVID, then the money we will borrow to fund that stimulus is, in my view, money that we would be borrowing anyway to tackle climate change. So therefore, this stimulus and all of our approaches to recovery has to have multiple benefits. It has to solve multiple problems at once. Therefore, it has to have resilience baked in. So for a city like Belfast, of our size and our scale and our importance, each lever we pull has to solve several problems at once. And in a way that echoes what's now been increasingly said globally and locally, whether it's the United Nations Secretary General who's talking openly and publicly about building back better, or whether indeed it's Professor Nicholas Stern, famously of the Stern Review, and his colleague in Oxford University and London School of Economics, who published a really important paper just 2 days ago, looking at what recovery could look like, should look like globally. And what they looked at was the potential for stimulus that would solve several problems at once. They concluded that progress on climate change will depend significantly on the policy choices we're going to make in the next 6 months. And indeed, yesterday in the United Kingdom, the government's statutory advisor on climate change, the UK Committee on Climate Change, gave advice, wrote to the Prime Minister, wrote to the heads of all of the 4 governments in the UK, and really stressed in that guidance and advice that the crisis has emphasised the importance of preparing for systemic risks. So that's why, in my view, it's hard to argue that we've any choice but to build in resilience as we think about and as we plan for recovery. I think all of us as Chief Resilience Officers, as Commissioners for Resilience, as we know, this is probably the shock of our lifetime in terms of its impact globally, but also the local impact right down to household level across our cities. Households are being affected by the impact of the crisis and are now starting to think about recovery and the role of local authorities and the role of city governments in building confidence, within our households, within our communities, and across our cities, for people to start thinking about what life will be like following the pandemic. So its impacts are different across different cities, and I think that's down to how our existing strengths and vulnerabilities play out. COVID-19 highlights the exposures to our systems in the same way, and yes, in the same way that climate change will do, but it's done it with immediate effect, and it's done it with profound effect, and that's what we're dealing with. So in Belfast, our draft resilience strategy will be a critical response to our recovery planning, because it's already identified our vulnerabilities, and those, there they are in front of you. Very interestingly, I think our resilience strategy will now be a really important framework and a resource through which to diagnose existing and future risks. So as you can see, some of the risks and some of the shocks and stresses to Belfast have been exacerbated by the pandemic. So health and educational inequalities we expect to have widened somewhat, though we haven't seen the data yet. But we're very concerned about a downward curve in opportunities, and our recovery planning will have to take account of that. 90% of our companies are small or micro businesses, and many of them with very little financial headroom. So again, those risks exposed and exacerbated. Some of our risks remain as they are, as they have been, so such as wastewater treatment capacity, but they continue to pose severe risks, and we face those daily. And then some of our weaknesses in so-called normal times may actually have served in the early stages of the pandemic to aid the city. So the lack of housing development in the city core, while normally is something that we would consider to be a stress and consider to be a systemic vulnerability, we think may have somewhat in the early days aided some of that shutdown and aided some of that isolation that was necessary in response to a pandemic. So what it means is, by having a resilience strategy in place, we have a framework through which to diagnose existing and future risks. It helps to focus our minds and simplify, I think, what otherwise would be a complex process of recovery. And in times of crisis, in my view, simplicity is key. What are we doing, and what are the steps that we're taking? Well, many cities, and we speak, and one of the wonderful things about the Global Resilient Cities Network is the fact that we are able to speak together as cities and able to think and plan collaboratively. And I think there's never been a more important time to plan collaboratively as cities. We're developing an approach which does four things. First of all, we need as a city to identify our assets and our capacity to build our recovery. So all of the levers that are available to us to accelerate recovery and accelerate rescue and recovery is really important, and putting in place immediate actions to support households, families, and businesses and communities across the city. Being very clear and using the right data, making sure that our data is telling us consistently the impact of the pandemic on our city, on society, our environmental impact, and our economic impact, and that's going to be critically important. And we will use and will continue to work directly with our university partners and other partners across the city to ensure that that data is developed in a coherent way, and we're defining the problems correctly, and we're finding the solutions using data. That will enable us to identify significant areas of focus, and like all of us, we can't do everything, so we will need to prioritise and put together in that fourth stage a really clear plan, and a number of cities now are developing and are publishing those plans. And I think, again, being able to learn alongside colleagues in other cities has been really critical. And I just wanted to suggest and mention an organisation, the RSA in the UK, who've done some really interesting work to frame change and to frame how we think about change, whether it's in our own home, whether it's in our organisation, or whether it's at a citywide level. And what they've looked at is thinking about how we've responded to the crisis. So in other words, there were things that we stopped doing as a city that we may not want to start again. We may want to continue not to do those things for a whole range of reasons, perhaps because the world has changed so much. There are things that we've stopped that we now need to turn back on again, but we may want to do in a different way. There are things that we've started that we will want to finish, and they will be COVID-related interventions that we will not want to continue with in due course. And then there are things that have started that we will want to continue. And many of us are now looking at behaviour change and how behaviour change by individuals and systemically may start to benefit us in ways that we either always knew they would or that we never expected. So understanding systems change is really important, and one of the things that we want to look at in some detail in Belfast as we move forward. So final few points for me in terms of what does success look like. In every major programme that I start, I like to think about what success will look like at the end. a number of things. First of all, we must have, as a city and as cities, learned lessons and used the lessons from the crisis to accelerate improvement of our resilience and improvement and focus on where our systemic weaknesses are. And should have adapted, so keeping positive behaviour change and using that to enable our resilience in the face of future crises. We need to focus on those major systemic weaknesses, whether it's inequalities and others, and really not lose sight of that as we go forward, and fundamentally being better prepared for the future, so that those climate-related risks, or whatever those long-term risks the cities are, we understand much more effectively, and that we've used the data and the information and the knowledge that we've needed to prepare ourselves. So I'm delighted to have taken part today. I'll hand back to Lauren, and I'm of course very happy to take part in an exchange at the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Grainia. I think we are going to try to pass the screen and the microphone back to Liz Yee. Hopefully we've got our tech sorted out, and then we'll go to Toby. We can't hear you yet. Oh no. Okay. I'm not sure if it's the speakers or if we're losing you. I know you do have to go a little bit earlier, Liz. I'm very sorry that we're not able to hear you very well. Let me pass the screen and the mic over to Toby so that we can keep going, and then we'll see if we can get to you right after his presentation. Oh, I'm hearing something. Is that you, Toby? Is that you unmuting?
I believe so.
Yeah. Okay. Well, without further ado, then let me pass the microphone over to Toby Kent, who is our Chief Resilience Officer in the City of Melbourne.
Thank you very much, Lauren. It's a pleasure to join everyone. So, hello. I'm going to talk to four things, building from Grainia's excellent overview of Belfast. So firstly, I'm just going to provide a bit of context about Melbourne. I'm going to talk then about how we applied some of the Global Resilient Cities Network framing and tools at a metropolitan level. And then I'm going to talk about how we're then now applying them during the COVID-19 pandemic, and finish up by touching on some how we've turned some of this work into training over the past 3 years. We've been delivering training on this now. So on the first slide, that is a map of Melbourne. There are, within that map, there are 32 municipalities that make up metropolitan Melbourne. When we began the work with what was at the beginning 100 resilient cities, the Rockefeller Foundation that backed 100 RC said, we'd love to work in Melbourne, but you have to find a way to work at a metropolitan scale for us to undertake this. And so we did just that. We applied the now well understood definition of urban resilience that has been adopted by many on this call, and that being really around the ability of a city and all of its constituent parts to adapt, survive, and thrive, no matter what kinds of chronic stress or acute shocks that they are experiencing. So we took, started with that definition. We went to all of the leaders of those councils and said, if we are to be a resilient Melbourne, that we cannot do this as any single city. However, we are hosted and a fundamental part of the city of Melbourne, which is represented by, you can see the arrow right in the middle. So the city of Melbourne, rather the map that is there in front of you, the entire metropolitan area is 10,000 square kilometers or 6,000 square miles. and the city of Melbourne is just 37 square kilometres within that 10,000 square kilometre mass. However, it accounts for over 40% of gross local product, and is home to the majority of the businesses and so forth that drive a lot of the economy and many of the things that make Melbourne internationally well known. So in terms of how we took it out then and got this collective buy-in, we did, as shown on the next slide, really draw from that definition that we had earlier, and then used the city resilience framework to map where we were strong, where we were vulnerable, where we might be strong now, but would likely be vulnerable going forwards, and conversely, were there things that were bad now that were getting better. The more that I have applied this work, the more that I've actually come to really appreciate the qualities of resilience, because they are quite intuitive as words. They are open to interpretation, which is why we do tend to include the little descriptive sentences along the side. But we've found that the framework is really good for thinking about activities or understanding the city at that urban scale. And then the qualities are excellent for getting into projects and thinking about how to set up specific activities. So we have actually now built these into a range of project templates so that we are always asking the question, and a bit like Grainia was saying in Belfast, where you're trying to not have any single action, only address one thing. But by using these qualities, we found we've been much able to target multiple benefits as a result of any single interaction. Now, in doing this, again, at a metropolitan scale, so we worked on this throughout 2015, and what the next slide represents is essentially the Resilient Melbourne strategy on a page. And just a couple of things on this. I say a couple, I think probably three things. So once we used the City Resilience Framework to essentially evaluate the city, we then dived into what we were going to do about it and applied the qualities as described. We further said, although the definition of urban resilience is shared, we need a vision that articulates it for what it is in Melbourne. And so Melbourne is a city it was 4.3 million when we did the strategy in 2015. It's 5 million today. So we're growing at about, pandemics aside, we're growing at about 100,000 people per year. And a very diverse society. So a third of all Melburnians speak a language other than English at home. So we wanted to recognize that. So in a resilient Melbourne, our diverse communities are viable, sustainable, livable, and prosperous. And so within that, our long-term objectives in many ways talk to what you might even call a traditional sustainable development agenda. And then the longer words, at the higher level, the four areas are essentially people, place, economy, and environment. The words that sit underneath headings like stronger together at the top. I don't necessarily know if you can read them all, but they begin to articulate them in the context of resilience framing. At a very simplistic level, I sometimes say, when people say, well, what's the difference? Isn't resilience just a new buzzword for sustainability and so on? I say, well, there are profound linkages between the two, but I would argue that for all of their shared activities, resilience is about continuing on that path to sustainable development while acknowledging that things will go wrong along the way. And so the final bit to this slide is that we then framed all of our actions around that definition of resilience about the ability to adapt, survive, and thrive. And finally said, but if we don't actually embed all of this work, it will be interesting, but not achieve the transformation that is required. So what I'll do now, I'm sorry just to keep talking at you, but I think with the numbers, we'll ask questions after. If we go on to the next slide now, I can talk to some examples of how we're really embedding in the context of COVID. So again, my apologies, you can't necessarily see this in detail, but it's not really the detail I want you to look at. I just want to talk about how we have taken the work that we applied at a metropolitan scale and are now working on this within a City of Melbourne specific context, as well as still doing other work and ongoing work with the broader metropolitan region. So within the City of Melbourne, we have created a future cities, or rather, sorry, a city futures and recovery task force. We used the city resilience framework to begin to group how we would have specific working groups within that task force. And so where we landed, there are 6 working groups within the task force. 2 are very economic focused. One is about how we support existing industries. The second one is how, as part of the recovery, do we encourage new industries? The third is how do we take the change that is being driven by COVID to really change the urban land use, the infrastructure, and the space needs. So that is both what are the changes that we are seeing as a result of COVID, and equally, what are the things that we would have loved to have done anyway that we can now maybe do accelerate as a consequence. Again, one of that is we're now putting in what was initially a 10-year plan to do 44 kilometers of protected bike lanes. Then with the climate emergency last year being declared, we moved that down to a 4-year plan. And now with COVID, while the city is relatively quiet, we're putting that in the protected bike lanes within 1 year. The fourth example is really how we accelerate digital infrastructure, both within the organization and for all users of the city. The fifth one is really trying to take a look at the profound implications of systems change, again, not just COVID, but more generally, and what that means for governments and how we engage our citizens in changes to a democratic system. And finally, we are looking at how we can maintain and develop a focus on community identity and cohesion, as well as mental health. So those are the 6 task forces. Because that community element is so strong within the resilience framing, I am the leader of the 6th working group around cohesion, identity, and health. And sitting underneath all of those things, we have those 6 cross-cutting areas where I'll quickly read them out: social equity, climate change, Aboriginal focus, resilience, and prosperity. And so within that, there are specific elements that will be picked up by the task forces, or by the working groups within the City Futures Task Force, as well as ensuring that, in this case, let's just take resilience as being something that has to be featured in every single one of those activities. Now, we have generated over the past 6 years quite a bit of experience in doing that, in doing work like this, in taking the resilience framing from Global Resilient Cities Network and applying it at different scales in different contexts. And we have a way of just quickly representing that on this final slide now, which really has at the top that definition again, And what we do is we now apply this. We have worked with or trained well over 1,000 practitioners in Melbourne, mainly from city government, as well as from state government, a few from the national government, businesses and non-profit organizations. And we teach them how to identify the chronic stresses and the acute shocks, be that at an organizational level or indeed at a state or city level. We then, and so the way that we've come to talk about it is the shocks and the stresses are really about understanding the trends and thus why you need to take action. The factors that sit within the city framework begin to help you identify what, and then the qualities you are really, when you're getting down into the nuts and bolts of projects, and thus they talk to the how of you, how you're going to do this. Now, we had, as originally planned, I think there's going to be a bit of kind of introduction to this, but I shall now make my own announcement, which is that we're really pleased to be working with the Global Resilient Cities Network. And so this is one of the announcements for this evening, to be offering online training, as we have done this in a system we call our Resilience Fundamentals Training, to member cities and to others. Lauren will talk more about this. As I say, we've trained well over 1,000 individuals using this process. And one of the glimmers of light that come out of the COVID crisis are that it forced us to take our training online. So we have already run one session. We have another online session. Oh no, we haven't. We've run 3 sessions actually. Sorry, online. We've got another one scheduled, and we look forward to working with whomever is interested and the GRCN to take this out to those of you on this call, and we hope many others. Again, as Grainia said, very happy to answer questions when we get there.
Thank you, Toby.
Your turn, Lauren, go ahead.
Thank you, Francis. It's really my pleasure. Hello again, everyone. I'm very sorry we lost Liz Yee, but she has promised to come back on a future webinar and talk to us about some of the work that Rockefeller Foundation is doing around expanding testing. So stay tuned for that. We will include that in a future speaker series. And then I really want to express my sincere gratitude to Grainia and Toby for their presentations. As Chief Resilience Officers, they are providing the practitioner examples that make what I'm about to talk to you all about relevant. Because at its core, urban resilience is an approach. It's theory until people who are actually working in cities and with cities make it a practice. And for the past 6 years, it's been my privilege to work with the cities in our network to move from theory to practice. And now it's time for me to talk about what that practice can do in response to the greatest resilience challenge of our generation. So if we can go to the next slide. Today, the Global Resilient Cities Network, which is the network of 98 cities led by Chief Resilience Officers, is launching Cities for a Resilient Recovery as a platform that is participatory for the exchange of tools, knowledge, and resources to build back better together. This is the first global program to be launched by our steering committee, which is made up of cities from our 5 regions. This participatory platform is the evolution of our network's response to COVID-19, which started this January, just before the Lunar New Year here in Singapore. This year, when I reached out to share greetings with Huangshe, which is a member city of ours that is less than 2 hours drive from Wuhan, instead of exchanging pleasantries, we were talking about a new virus. And only days later, the first case of COVID-19 in Singapore was diagnosed less than 2 miles from my home. Immediately, the government here in Singapore, chastened by their SARS experience, sprang into action. And we knew we needed to as well. Huangshe had a story to tell. The city was in lockdown and it was using technology to keep the city running and strict social distancing measures to control the spread of the virus. In early February, while many governments were reluctant to sound the alarm, our network knew we couldn't be. Coronavirus was the kind of global challenge exacerbated by increasing urbanization and globalization that we'd been preparing for. And we knew if we could get the right messages to the right people, we could save lives. So we established a three-pronged approach to accelerate the integration of resilience and response and recovery. First, we established confidential peer-to-peer channels for communications within our own internal CRO network in late February. And then second, the first week of March, this speaker series kicked off with our partners from the World Bank. And to date, we've been able to gather about 4,500 people across very different and diverse communities of resilience practitioners globally. And then finally, today, we are launching Cities for Resilient Recovery. Next slide. So why are we launching a program for resilient recovery right now? Well, it does seem that everyone, everywhere, has been advocating for versions of what we're calling a new normal. But how are we actually going to get there? We all know that cities are addressing the immediate health, economic, and social support service needs. But if we wait until the crisis is over to plan our recovery, the opportunity to build back better together and to address the vulnerabilities and failures in our systems will have passed. And as you've heard from our speakers tonight, as well as many others in the weeks that have passed, we don't have to wait. But to try to figure out how to best support cities in this moment, we did a lot of listening first. And along with our partners at Dahlberg Advisors, we reached out across the network to find out what kind of support cities really needed to ensure that we could build a resilient recovery. So here's what we found out. Cities are ready to plan resilient recovery. 88% of the network members of GRCN have already started recovery planning. And while there are resilience practitioners, wherever you are, you're being called on to play central roles. So cities who have done this kind of resilience planning are already working and using, in 75% of cases, resilience strategies as a starting point and a place to find projects. But much more is needed in terms of on-the-ground efforts. Principles and plans are great, but cities across the network have said that there is demand for practical tools that are more place-based and people-centered. And what's more than that, we're hearing that for specific challenges, whether it's equity, climate resilience, or waste management, there's a desire to deliver recovery efforts with partners who can later continue on and help cities to build stronger, more resilient systems. So how do we begin to prioritize? Next slide. We knew that cities would be fighting the pandemic against the backdrop of existing shocks and stresses, which influences the impacts of the virus. So we gathered information about the most pressing worries across this network. And unsurprisingly, the top priorities were creating opportunities and equity as we rise from COVID-19. 79% of member cities agree that enhancing social equity is the top priority for recovery. So while some would see this as a gap, what we see here is an amazing opportunity for knowledge sharing and innovation in recovery. Next slide. So, true to resilience practice, the biggest worries are translating into the highest priorities for recovery. There's some regional variation here, I just have to say. And so for those who want to dive deeper with us into that variation, and hopefully many of you will, so that we can together work to solve for the articulated needs here, I would encourage you to access the full report on the Cities for Resilient Recovery website. What's very clear is that there's room for innovation and peer-to-peer learning in COVID recovery, in particular around achieving equitable outcomes and delivering food and water security and accelerating climate action. Some are focused very much on community level initiatives, while others are very focused on major infrastructure. Next slide. In terms of the kinds of gaps, what we're hearing from across the network is that we need much more connectivity around what the funding opportunities are. What kind of data is really necessary to prioritize? We also need to build up municipal staff capacity and make time to build that resilience into recovery planning, and we need much better collaboration between different decision makers. And so while there's never been a universal challenge like COVID before giving us this urgency, there's also not been a new challenge in any of our cities that we didn't know about. So that means that cities can really effectively look to each other and say, hey, how did my colleagues over there in Accra use community mapping in informal communities to prioritize relief? And then how are they using that now to plan longer term improvements? And how did our colleagues in Melbourne or in Milan or Oakland fast track some of their pedestrian projects or bike lanes because of this opportunity? So if it's been done, you can find it, and then you don't have to face these challenges alone. So now is really the time to stare vulnerabilities right in the face and not run away. Make them opportunities to build back better in an inclusive way. And so that's what our network, anchored by Chief Resilience Officers in each of our cities, wishes to deepen and expand now through the communities we're facilitating in the Cities for Resilient Recovery program. So while we know that no single organization can answer these incredibly complex challenges, we're here to guide and we're here to facilitate. Next slide. So this is about a global coalition. This is not a time for clubs with members only. This is time for us to say that these are all cities who can learn from each other, not certain learning cities and certain teaching cities. It's a time for that open and honest learning. So Cities for Resilient Recovery will provide knowledge, tools, and resources to both members and non-member cities who are committed to embedding resilience in recovery. Next slide. What does that mean? How can your city take part? If your city is interested in building back better together and starting to think about this new normal, you can go to the landing page for Cities for Resilient Recovery, and you can answer some very basic questions about your current needs and your recovery thinking. This is open to Chief Resilience Officers and other senior city leaders, and also partners can join this effort in recovery planning. So what will members share? They'll share knowledge, learning, and data, and they'll also work together to advocate for additional resources, publicly taking a stance as part of this coalition and mobilizing political leadership too. Members of the coalition can access specific and dedicated communities that will have real-time exchange between practitioners with common challenges. We will have an overall learning community that builds on this Cities on the Frontline Speakers series that we will continue to partner with the World Bank on and activate this larger community. In addition, we are partnering with the Circulate Initiative and the Ocean Conservancy to provide cities with knowledge and tools they require to take immediate and longer-term action to manage waste. We want to be able to help cities provide relief for waste workers, and also as cities begin to invest in those longer-term recovery plans, build towards more circular economy initiatives that unlock economic, environmental, and social benefits. And we'll be creating additional communities that respond to city demands too. Very soon. We already have some of those brewing, and we'll share those shortly. And then finally, as Toby mentioned, along with the City of Melbourne, we're bringing Resilience Fundamentals, a course that they've offered to over 1,000 people, and that we and GRCN have offered in terms of training only before for Chief Resilience Officers and cities in the network online. So if you're interested, you can sign up to join us for that. So with that, I just want to say thank you very much for listening to me. It's a very new role for me instead of facilitating to speak this evening. But more importantly, I'm really grateful to everyone who's already shared so much of your knowledge and for speaking out. This is really just the beginning, and we're looking forward to building out this platform as the basis for the next chapter of our urgent work together to build a more resilient urban future. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Lauren. I think we have the honor of having with us Sameh Wahba, who's the Director for Urban Development and Disaster Risk Management, the Global Practice Group at the World Bank, who's supporting this initiative. And so we thought it would be judicious to have Sameh say a few words of the role of the World Bank and in supporting this initiative. Sameh, the screen is yours. Go ahead, I think we can hear you. No, we cannot hear you. Sameh, you're still on mute. Is it Nini, can you unmute Sameh? We seem to quite a lot of technical issues today. Our panelists. If let's give him a minute to try to connect, and otherwise, Lauren then could probably quickly place one question from the participants to the panelists. We'll see if it...
Sure. There was a question that came in very early on in the presentations about whether we at 100RC considered pandemics and related challenges to pandemics as part of our resilience strategy and planning. And I know that both of the CROs on the line very likely have comments to that. And I would just say, just as a broader introduction on that theme, that when we look at the city resilience framework that was shown earlier in the slides, health and well-being is a full 1/4 of that. And so looking at what the health threats are in a community, what they are at the moment, and then what they could be down the road is very much a part of the planning process that we take with urban resilience. And then maybe I'll open it up for Toby and Grainia if you'd like to comment on how in your cities, in your strategy process, you may have had experience with that.
Lauren, if I may, I would like to add a question, because it's a question we're really struggling with at the World Bank, and I thought it was an excellent question from one of the participants who asked, how would the panelists suggest to include within existing stimulus package measure to address long-term social, economic, and even environment resilience in the cities they represent? Are they running into the same challenges, and what have they done about it? And then Sameh will come to you 3 minutes before the end. Sorry about the hiccup.
I can see that I'm off mute, so while I'd be very happy to let Grainia go first, I can't see Grainia, so oh, there she is. She is muted, so I'll just kick off. Absolutely, as Lauren says, a quarter of the CRF is devoted to health and well-being. In Melbourne, in 2015, we did identify that a potential major shock for us would be pandemic. One of the things that we need to think about as city actors is, because we were trying to get 32 councils to agree to a strategy, people said, well, if we have a pandemic, it's really going to be addressed by state government and national government. We'll just get on with our business. Now, the reality of the pandemic is showing that it requires full involvement of local government, state, for those of us who work in a 3-tiered system, so either local government or a national government, and whatever you've got in between. So that's so absolutely the GRCN approaches are valuable for that. And just very quickly, in terms of Francis's question, which is, I would imagine the World Bank is better placed than me to give you real detail about what to include within your stimulus packages. But just to give you some examples of things we're doing, I mentioned the task forces within the City of Melbourne. So we have a Capital Works task force, and that is both looking at what are the things we can no longer afford to do, but also what are the things that we should accelerate doing now, because they are going to have higher job rates or other social and environmental factors. So Melbourne has become quite well known for our work, both within the City of Melbourne and at a metropolitan scale, around the creation of our metropolitan urban forest. So actually that is a outdoors, tree planting, vegetation management, and so forth is permitted under lockdown. So we are putting a lot more money and effort into that. It's a great way of securing a long-term environmental as well as social outcome and a short-term economic impact. Our work around the bike lanes is similar in that sense. And we have had, again, I'm very conscious of being in a privileged situation that we have been able to do this. But the City of Melbourne has not 100%, but about as close as you can get to this moment in time, has committed to no redundancies, but people are having to redeploy. So people are retaining their income potential. And the way that we're doing that, all our libraries are closed, but our librarians have been retrained to be handle calls and inquiries for every single business in the City of Melbourne. So they're not just waiting for it to be contacted, but we are actively contacting every single business that is registered in the city to provide advice around how they can get grants and other support. Again, not necessarily from the city, sometimes from the city, but at a national level, in the same way that we took a lot of our parking attendants and retrain them to do disinfecting work and so forth. So things we've done to address an immediate issue and provide some economic support, and then other things that we're doing to have longer term benefits and more in the economic stimulus space. I should probably give someone else a chance to talk.
So Toby, I'd like to touch on the question, Francis, that you asked around stimulus. And I think there's no perfect solution here. If there was, someone would have come up with it by now. However, as someone who spent quite a bit of time following the global financial crash in 09-10, working with the UK's housing market, some of it feels just a bit too close. So soon, you know, with so much institutional memory, we have to learn from how we structured stimulus back then. And we made some really good moves, but we made some mistakes too. So I think we need to open that drawer, take the file out and start pulling some of those lessons together again. And I suppose from my perspective, these are just some observations from me. I think, as I said earlier, we only have one pot. So therefore, I would say that stimulus needs to be directed at those solutions that are multiple problem solvers. So we don't have the bandwidth, and frankly, we don't have the luxury to be chopping things up. We need to be solving several problems at once. I also would argue that and I would go back to a piece of work. I think it was originally the Institute for Fiscal Studies in the UK who first coined the phrase "stimulus should be timely, targeted, and temporary." And I would say that phrase is still really relevant today. So it needs to be targeted, it needs to be very focused, and I would say investment with purpose, so mission-oriented stimulus, where we're really clear where it's going. It does need to be timely, and it needs to be temporary. So in other words, it has to have everything that you put in, we have to have an exit strategy for when it comes out, because otherwise you start to restructure in ways that we may well regret in the future. So from my perspective, I would say this, wouldn't I, given the priorities that I've said are there for Belfast, but I will certainly be measuring the success of stimulus around, if you go back to those shocks and stresses, what levers can we pull that can solve several problems at once? So for example, a really obvious one for me is investment in our housing stock. So we've got a number of things coming our way in the next decade. We need to decarbonise rapidly. We need to, housing is a major source of emissions, not just in terms of how we design it and how we build it, but how we manage it. So therefore, we need to be looking at programmes whereby you invest in the future of our housing stock, and that will keep people warm or keep people cold at the right times of the year. Do it in a way that brings together all of the professions, where you ensure you're investing in architects and designers right through to those trades, so that you're stimulating the local economy as well as supply chains. And also, and again, all of the data shows this, the most effective stimulus is stimulus which is as rapid as possible. So again, we will start to see that impact very quickly in local communities, and you will put money back into people's pockets. So there are a number of solutions that I think were posed back in 2009, 2010 that weren't adopted for a whole range of reasons. But I think we now need to look at them again, and we need to also think about how do we now learn some of the lessons over the last decade. So for example, how we design our homes has changed, and we've learned an awful lot about technology, low carbon buildings that we can now apply. So in many ways, we're in a much better place because we have that institutional memory. But my goodness, we always do this, don't we? We start every crisis thinking, no, this is so different from the previous ones, when actually there's an awful lot to learn.
Thank you, Grainia. Let's see if Sameh is now finally connected. It seems that all the VIP today have difficulties connecting, but Nini, if you could connect Sameh.
Can you hear me now?
Now we can hear you, yes. Welcome, Sameh. Sorry about the technical hiccups.
So now it's okay. Okay. So thanks a lot. And so I just wanted to brief you very quickly about what we're doing in the World Bank in terms of COVID-19 response, and to explain why we're, particularly excited about this new, Cities for a Resilient Recovery program by the Global Resilient Cities Network. So at the bank, as our president has announced, we have a package of 160 billion that are being programmed over the coming 15 months. The thrust of this package is on 4 different pillars. One is on the public health emergency, which was our first phase of support to health interventions, the surge in capacity and demand, and PPEs and ventilators and what have you, to help basically offset the crisis and take the immediate interventions that are needed also to flatten the curve. As part of that work, our team with Francis and with the many people on the call today, one of the things we've done is we've provided a lot of liquidity via our lines of credit for disaster risk preparedness. So these were prepared ex ante with the countries, with the policies and interventions that are needed, and when a disaster hits, then they provide immediate liquidity to help offset the crisis without raiding the budget and cutting off other types of essential services. And then now we're preparing for the big phase that includes all the focus on the poor and the vulnerable, the private sector, and of course the stimulus package. And throughout these various pillars, obviously there's a very important role for cities, because they are on the front line, like the name of this speaker series is. I mean, cities are in the front line in caring for the affected, whether it's health, whether it's the economically affected, those whose livelihoods are affected and therefore need a combination of cash transfers, food distribution, and other types of jump-starting of their livelihoods with labor-intensive public works and so on and so forth. But also cities need to maintain essential services running, and they need to also put in place strategies and plans and implement the early recovery process, all while their revenues are shrinking because of the contraction in economic activities. So cities are really having it the hard way, and therefore being able to bring together cities that are in the front line and not just avail the financing for them, because I mean, we're literally, fixing the bike while we're riding it. I mean, so therefore there's a great role in there for knowledge exchange, for learning, for peer-to-peer learning. And this is how basically, the ideas about what policies and interventions to put in place, what works and what doesn't work. So therefore being able to create that space for city officials to exchange, to ensure that things that are working are disseminated widely, things that are not working, the lessons learned from them are extracted and shared, I think provides a great complement. There's going to be a lot of money going into post-COVID response, and how to inform the better ways to spend that money. What seems to be working, what will work in one place is not going to work in another place. Targeting the poor works better if you have systems in place and cadasters. When you don't have, you think about place-based approaches. So there's going to be a lot of action on the ground and lessons learned. So being able to create that platform for knowledge sharing becomes really valuable. So congratulations to the Global Resilient Cities Network for this great initiative, and on behalf of the World Bank, we're very happy to help and support. So thanks, and over to you.
Thanks, Sameh. We're so thrilled to be launching this and to keep the conversation going and focused on what we can do together to innovate in these common challenge areas for cities. I know we're over time because I'm getting that look and that text from Francis. So I am going to bring the session to a close. I will remind everyone that we are here every week at the same time. Next week, we will be diving into one of the common challenges that many of our city members are facing around how to protect, take care of, and then strengthen systems for migrants and welcoming them in cities. We will have representatives from the Mayor's Migration Council and also from the International Rescue Committee and the City of Los Angeles with us. Please tune in, register. An invitation will be going out on Monday. And for those who are interested, please do go to the Cities for Resilient Recovery website. I've placed the note in the chat, and we'll also send it via email. We're really looking forward to continuing this conversation and to leveraging this resilience exchange for impact. Thanks, everyone.
Many thanks.